Hi, everyone, and welcome to Mental Health for Working Parents, where together with mental health professionals, we speak about various emotional demands of parenting without shame or stigma. And I'm very happy to be here today with Stephanie Arrington. And hi, Stephanie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. And we're going to talk about the topic that I really know from my experience personally and professionally, many parents are very anxious about. And it's going to be about transitioning back to work after having children, career after having children. So we're just going to have a conversation about, all of the demands, all of the challenges, and we're going to share our personal experiences. We're going to share what we see in our practices. So just before we start, I'm just going to introduce Stephanie really quickly, and please, Stephanie, jump in and add if I miss out on something that you feel is important and would like our audience to know. So Stephanie is a licensed clinical social worker in the US, and she has over 13 years of experience as a psychotherapist. And so Stephanie has a private practice and specializes in maternal mental health. And I'm going to ask you a little bit more about it shortly. And in addition to her clinical work, she also has over decades of experience in leadership roles in corporate health care. And also, you're busy now as I'm reading it. She's the National Director of Operations for a mental health startup. And she's a mom of two and a survivor of postpartum anxiety after her older child. And we're also going to talk about that because I know how much impact that as well would have on going back to work. So just to open up the conversation, I just want to ask you, just kind of tell me about your whole transition as you became a parent and what impact, if any, I don't know, what impact it had on your career.
Sure, absolutely. Again, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here talking about this topic. Maternal mental health is close to my heart. I am a survivor of postpartum anxiety after my first child that developed during my maternity leave with, signs and symptoms that are classic of anxiety that at the time I didn't even realize were happening to me. So here I am on maternity leave, struggling with anxiety, feeling like I don't have the resources or the support in place to address it. And then I have to return to work. And
can I just ask you just like about those symptoms? What were they? Because I'm really mindful that they would be different for a lot of people, and also my experience, because I've also had perinatal anxiety that I had no idea this is what I was struggling with. So I just want to ask you if you could talk maybe like a little bit for people to also possibly recognize that what they are dealing with also could be related to perinatal anxiety.
Absolutely. Perinatal anxiety and depression really start showing within the first year postpartum. So 1 in 5 women develop postpartum depression or anxiety either during pregnancy or up to that 1 year after giving birth. And postpartum depression and anxiety are the common diagnoses that we see, but we also see postpartum OCD, we see postpartum psychosis, and we also see postpartum PTSD. And in the field, really what we're looking for is, when it comes to anxiety, that constant worry, feeling like something bad's going to happen, to your child, racing thoughts, just not sleeping, not eating well, really inability to just sit still, and really not be able to recover after birth for yourself, but then also, just having constant worries about your child as well.
Yeah. And that kind of has been similar to my experience, I guess. And I think the challenge for me was to kind of really to differentiate, what was kind of normal as a new
Mhm.
parent, because I think some of those things can be just a normal part of becoming a parent, some of those fears,
Absolutely.
some of those kind of self-doubts, and long recovery, obviously, especially depending on the birth. So could you just maybe talk a little bit about when to know that this is definitely more than just kind of common expected features of parenting?
Absolutely. And that's such a great distinction. So, postpartum, those first 2 weeks where your hormones are really, in flux and shifting, those first 2 weeks is really what's known as the baby blues. And that is so typical, so normal to experience after you give birth. But once you start feeling those symptoms of depression or anxiety, it's 6 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months out. That's when you have to really start worrying and thinking about, do I have postpartum depression and anxiety? In the perinatal mental health field, we think of the postpartum period up to 1 year after giving birth. If you go to your doctor in the medical field, they're going to say the postpartum period is only 6 weeks after you give birth, which is such like striking contrast
Yeah.
to what we actually know, like in the research to show that you can experience these symptoms that are temporary and treatable up to 1 year postpartum.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is such a huge kind of, systematic issue that all of us have, right? It's kind of, parents go for this 6 weeks checkup, mothers go for this 6 weeks checkup, and then they're kind of released. Normally, I mean, I don't kind of know how it is in the US, but in London and in Portugal, where I do have experience with my children, it's kind of very general questions about mainly a baby, especially if you go and do it privately, that there are no questions at all.
Right.
So it's really not something where an assessment is very common. So I
Right.
think a lot of people just basically kind of fall through the system, even if they do kind of have some of the concerns, even if they do struggle, even within that 6 weeks period more, and they kind of even know that something might be outside of normal, but they just kind of get released. And I think that's just one of the systematic issues that really kind of is a part of that bigger problem. And I guess the reason why not many parents do get support, right?
Absolutely. And we see the same thing in the US. At your 6 week appointments, post birth, no one's really asking the questions how you're feeling. There's no screenings that we know are reliable, that are valid to show whether or not you are struggling with depression and anxiety. They're just not being used. And so a lot of the work in the field of perinatal mental health is, how do we get these screening tools in place so that our medical doctors are in fact assessing for this at that 6 week appointment?
Yeah, for sure. And so just kind of going back to the topic. So you were noticing some of those symptoms. And so when did you have to go back to work, or when did you decide that it was time to go back to work, or did you kind of have to go back to work, which was your choice? Yeah, I guess just talk a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Here in the US, your employment is legally, held for you 3 months postpartum. And so, knowing that, also taking into account, my family and my finances, I did go back to work 4 months postpartum. So I did take that extra month, more than most people would take, to go back to work because I had to.
Yeah. And how was that for you? Obviously, kind of, considering what you've shared and, having some of those, how do you recall that? How would you describe that?
Yeah, it was overwhelming. Just the thoughts of, can I do this? How am I going to do this? How are we going to do this? What happened at work while I was gone, right? Like, did they miss me? Do they need me? What happened to my work? Really having these ideas of self-doubt that were going through my head, and just feeling like I was not prepared to return back to work, which I think is pretty common for most women that I work with. They just have these feelings of self-doubt and worry and concern about what's going to happen when they go back to the workforce.
Yeah, and I think this is such a kind of interesting paradox almost, because I remember that was kind of very similar to my experience, those doubts. And I think for me, because I've always been such a kind of career driven, career oriented person, I'm a perfectionist. So for those of you who are going to listen and who know, who are perfectionists as well, like it's for me, like the sense of self is very much based on achievements, it's very much based on kind of things that we do as opposed to just being. So I think that was one of the paradox for me in terms of the career when I had my older son, and I was kind of struggling because before I had him, I thought everything is going to be just the same. I had this kind of idea that professionally, I know what I want. I know what I worked hard for. I'm just going to like have a baby, and then I'm just going to go back really fast, and everything is going to be the same because my career is really important. It's something that's like a huge part of my life, huge part of my identity. So I remember my kind of paradox was in between, okay, so trying to repeat everything, trying to do everything the same, but then also what you're describing, kind of not being ready emotionally and having those kind of anxiety system and not being sure how I can be present at work while being away from the baby. And while I was with the baby, I also had huge anxiety because there was a part of me that thought I'm really missing my work, I'm missing my career. There was like this big sense that I was, missing out on something.
Yeah. And it's a conversation that, is not discussed quite often, especially for first-time mothers, that, things change, things about you, things about your life, things do change, and you're going back to the same environment in most cases, where you all of a sudden have to really start thinking about your identity, who you are, who you want to become, not just as a mother, but also as an employee. What does that mean for your, you're talking about your personal ambition, your professional ambition, and that had to shift and change. All of a sudden, you're putting boundaries into place that didn't exist before, probably before you had, a child for the first time, you were working probably late hours, or you were working in a way that made sense for your lifestyle then. But children have a really great way of forcing us to put boundaries in place, especially in our professional careers, that is very different for what we're used to and for our identity.
Yeah. And I think that was kind of my experience that I think made this whole transition more challenging for me, that there was this really, I didn't want to slow down professionally. And I think at that point, I thought that I really can do it all. So I put that huge expectation on me that, somehow I need to do it all, I need to be present there and there. And I think this is also something that I see a lot in my practice, and this made my anxiety worse. It led to burnout. It was really something those pressures, especially because I also went back to work. I think my son was around 3 months. So I haven't even physically recovered at that point because my birth was quite traumatic. So it was really kind of a big identity shift in that way. And I think it was just trying to balance it all made it even more difficult to process.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of expectation, like societal expectation, that we do it all. When we look at social media, when we talk to our friends or our family who aren't so open about their experiences, because we aren't really told that others are struggling with similar things. Like no one tells you it's going to be this hard, and no one tells you that other people are struggling with the same exact issues, because we're told that we need to do it ourselves. We need to handle it all. We need to know how to do it, when to do it, and add an expectation. And, you talked earlier about your perfectionism, and wanting to do it perfect and wanting to do it all. We are being fed those messages, on a large scale, but then also like on a one-to-one scale with our friends and family and with social media. So it's no wonder that we feel so burnt out when we're jumping back into work 3 months postpartum, when it takes your body at least 18 months to recover from the birth. And it takes you up to 2 years to start feeling like yourself again. How can you negotiate that and transition and expect yourself to be at the same place you were before you gave birth, before you had children? It's so unrealistic. And that is what leads to mental health, concerns and issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're saying, about those societal messages, I know that very often, I went back to work in my private practice, and then I launched my mental health business. So I didn't have to go back to like an environment that was corporate, but I know with a lot of clients of mine who actually did have to go back very soon to corporate environment. There was no support available for working parents, and also I was just reading the research recently that was done in the UK, and I'm going to actually link the reference because I don't have it now, but the research was basically that it takes women 10 years after having a baby to go back to the same level of career that they had before pregnancy, and it takes them 10 years to go back to the same level of like remuneration, career, because obviously having children puts a lot of weight and a lot of kind of a lot of parents generally, but that research was specifically about mothers, basically feel the pressure to go back to their corporate jobs as soon as possible because they don't want to miss out, they don't want to lose on the and also like many parents don't have a choice, so they actually have to go back to support their families, but for what various reasons they're actually unable to perform the way that they've had before having children, and they actually have to either step down from this position, or they have to, when they come from the maternity leave, they have to take another role, or their responsibilities somehow change. So basically there's no support available for parents who are kind of doing this transition that, as you were describing, is so demanding on many levels, and it takes a couple of years, but there is literally no support, and only a few companies offer that, only a few companies recognize that there might be something additionally that we cannot actually offer to working parents as a way to make this transition easier, but ultimately, also make their performance better, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I always encourage the mothers that I work with, that I also did myself, is to network and find those mothers, whether that be, in your place of employment or elsewhere externally, to be able to connect and really, get that mentorship to get back into the workforce, because your employer is probably not going to provide that for you. It's very limited. Either the corporations or the organizations or, the employers that are going to provide resources to, help you adjust and transition back. And it does fall a lot of times to us to be able to network with other working mothers to help get that mentorship and support, to help us feel like we can continue to excel professionally.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm just interested about your experience, because I think especially when, and you've said how common, right? How common perinatal anxiety is, how common perinatal depression is. burnout, perinatal OCD, birth trauma, is number one complication of having a baby, right? And that recovery is, so it has such a huge impact on parenting generally, and being a working parent. So I'm just kind of wondering, because I feel like very open, because there's so much shame and stigma, and there's no openness, around talking about those things. So parents go back to work, and even if they do struggle, there is almost like they try to make sure that it's not something that they share because of that stigma, that we can't really talk about this in a work environment, right? We can't talk about how the birth was. We can't talk about how the parenting, like how parenting affected us. It's not really something expected, and then that creates the sense of isolation. So can you just talk a little bit of your experience kind of in terms of that when you went back to work? I mean, obviously I know it will be different in our case because we do work in mental health, but just for your clients perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, you're right, it is a stigma that, we shouldn't talk about how difficult this was. No one is going to come up to you and say, like, I understand the postpartum period is so difficult. How can I help you transition and, help you feel good about coming back to work? For me, I was quite fortunate that I did have a boss who was a working mother herself. She too had her own mental health issues. And so as a leader, she was able to, have that conversation with me and start that conversation, whereas I probably wouldn't have with someone else. And so I always consider her a model for what a leader truly is for mothers, like coming back into the workforce, and how we should approach it with people that we either work with, who are colleagues, or whether there are supervisees, people we mentor. I always think of her who, really extended that conversation first, to be able to talk about, like, this is pretty hard, and what do I need to adjust back?
Yeah. And that sounds very nice and very unique. I'm very much aware of how I think unique it is, because I do have so my mental health business is actually I do work with companies to help to develop mental health programs for working parents, and I really do know that not many companies, it is growing, which is amazing, and it's wonderful, and that's one of the purpose of my business. And at the same time, I do know how many parents are not going to receive that, so that makes it even more, as you've said, it is a model that we really should, just like as the society, to follow and to promote. And I do think that actually talking about mental health at work is what we have to do, because mental health affects everything, right, including what we do at work. So I kind of want this is why I'm so open, about my own journey, because I just feel that the more open we are, the less stigma it is. And then if the companies start supporting working parents, right, this is where we will see the bigger change, because then it's going to be just, the impact is going to be more significant.
Absolutely. And I am curious, what types of programs that you do work with companies to implement, because it feels like here in the US, companies need just basic education and basic support to put things in place, like a lactation room, or, modified schedules, or even like a part-time schedule until you can, officially, shift back into the workplace. So I am curious, what you see that could be supportive.
Yeah. And I think this is kind of part of the practical stuff that I guess like some of the companies are doing already. So what I do, I just offer mental health programs like around various emotional demands that parents face, and just kind of giving psychoeducation to parents who who work at companies write about very common challenges. So it's more like a loyalty program that they offer to support working parents with mental health. But absolutely what you've said is a really important adjustments as well, and I almost kind of like feel that this should be basic by now. It's almost like this is something I know. Like I was just like talking to someone, like a colleague of mine, and he was talking that 15 years ago, no companies would offer nurseries. Some companies, they would say there's never going to be time that companies would have like a nursery on premises for children, because it's a business environment and kids are not going to be ever allowed. We only talk business here. And I think now there are so many companies who actually realize that, there needs to be, life is not only work, and actually working parents are happy and they feel supported, that they're going to be more productive at work. So I think now more companies realize that this is just a must-have, and kind of things like what you've described for working parents. I almost like feel now, if you don't do it as a company, it's really, it's just like you're not really responding to the needs of times, right? Because working parents, I always talk how I feel working parents are the least supported demographics.
Absolutely. Yes.
And this is why I think I'm so passionate about it. Just parents generally, but I think for those parents who don't have any support, who do have to go back to work really fast after having children, who, find it really challenging. And I think those companies who they work for are almost the only source of potential support they have. So I think that this is why I'm so kind of passionate about it, is that, I just think demographics is not supported at all, as I've said.
Yeah, a lot of the women that I work with in my private practice, like they don't have a community. They don't have, the family or the friends around them. And they really do feel like they're doing it on their own. And when they feel that way and they're transitioning back into the workforce, it feels like it should be basic requirements that they get some sort of support. So they get like a mentor to help them come back into the workforce. They get lactation room. They get modified schedules, at least initially, to help them transition back and figure out things like childcare and commuting to work and just those basic, things that we take for granted, before you become a parent. Things like employee assistance programs and childcare assistance. If they had a daycare on site, that would be amazing. These things that we take for granted, are so helpful for when women are transitioning back into the workforce.
Yeah. And could you just talk a little bit, just what do you think are your most challenges as a working parent? Like, because you are busy, like when I was reading your introduction, I was like, you are doing a lot of different things, and obviously you have two children. How old are your children?
They are 3.5 and 2 years old.
Oh wow, so they're also so young, and you have such a small gap in between them as well.
Yes.
And you did have a perinatal anxiety with the older one. Okay, so wow,
Yes.
So just share how do you do it?
I'm thankful that I have a supportive partner. Most people don't. I do. I have a partner who works in the field of maternal health and family planning. So he gets it.
That's the secret.
That is the secret. So he gets it, and he really understands and is very supportive of me having this, very corporate lifestyle, but then also having a private practice as well. And so it took us a while to figure it out, but the hardest part is really managing schedules. juggling all of the things that, you need to do, whether it be professionally or personally, to keep your life running and moving. And so we do a few things that, really support us. One is that we coordinate on our schedules. We kind of have a check-in where it's like, what's happening this week? What are you doing? What are you doing? What am I responsible for? What are you responsible for this week? And really looking at the administrative load of parenting. Typically that falls to the mother. But that's shifting a little bit, especially with my generation, that's shifting a little bit, but it's still, the burden really falls on the mother to take that administrative load. And so really having that communication with my partner to say, hey, we're both really busy. How can we look at this administratively, where you take some tasks, I take some tasks, so that neither of us feel so overloaded and so burnt out? Because if I had to do it all, I would be burnt out and I wouldn't be able to do all of this that I want to do.
Yeah. And did you have like a conversation, because I feel in my experience, there's almost, as you said, there's an expectation is going to be a woman who's going to put the career on hold, right? Yes. And I know that a lot of mothers want to do that, and it's amazing, it's wonderful if it's a choice. But I think sometimes when it's like an external expectation that it's going to be you, as a matter of fact, who is going to have that responsibility. So, you can just wait for whatever years. Well, according to the research I've mentioned, it's 10 years. So you're going to wait for 10 years until you can do those things you've worked your ass for before you had children, right? So like, did you kind of have that conversation about, okay, so now let's talk about, my ambitions, my plans when it comes to career, and kind of make a plan as to how we're going to raise children also while having two separate careers. So how did you navigate it?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was mindset. So I, accepted, and I also, talked to the mothers that I work with, that the first year is really survival mode. You are surviving. When it feels like you're finally coming out of that place where you're not in survival mode anymore, that's really a great time to have these conversations about what you need, whether that be personally or professionally. Obviously, you're working towards that, and you should try to have that healthy communication around roles and responsibilities. But until you're feeling better physically, mentally, emotionally, it's very hard to have those conversations without it impacting your mental health. And so I tried to think of that first kind of year postpartum as like survival mode. And that really, especially with my second, after I had her, I thought, I have my maternity leave. I have that first year to really like figure out having two children. And I also took that time to think about, what do I want to do professionally? And I took that maternity leave, my second maternity leave, to actually change careers. So I was working for a, corporate health insurance company that focused on mental health and behavioral health. And I was on my second maternity leave, and I realized like, I don't want to do that anymore. And, this is where I used my network of, professional mothers. And I said, what's out there for me? And I found this startup that is focusing on mental health. And so I shifted, in that first year of my postpartum with my second, to actually change my career, because I did have that mindset where I gave myself that like freedom to say like, this is crisis mode, this is survival mode, and then the rest will come into place. And it did, because I allowed that for myself.
Yeah. And I think this is such a great, I know you didn't kind of was saying this as an advice, but I do think this is such a great feedback, that it is really a survival. And I think in that year, it might seem that, you need to have it all figured out, and, and you're kind of going to feel, so, I mean, that's what my experience, feeling all these pressures to be perfect, to have that clarity, to like achieve in my career, to go back to normal, to do all those things. And I think just kind of normalizing that it is going to be that year when you are going to try to find your own way to manage, to cope, to understand, as you've said, because of like an identity shift that we were talking about. A lot of parents would find themselves into this kind of, okay, so is actually what I was doing before, does it fit in? Because of how major the transition is, I really see that a lot of mothers are kind of deciding that, and my kind of experience with parenting also really kind of shaped my private practice. This is why I've launched my mental health business. So I think it's just allowing the time to allow yourself that transition and to just kind of see where you're at. And I think it's really so important to just think about this. If you're surviving, you're already doing so bloody good.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love the phrase, like I really work with my moms to really think of the phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. You have changed just by giving birth, whether it be a first time mom, a second or third time mom, you've changed. But if you're going back to the workforce, you're going back to the same employer, chances are things there haven't really changed very much. So chances are you are going back into the same environment, but you're a different person. So this is such a great opportunity to really reclaim your identity, and really use that as an opportunity to figure out who you are again, to mourn, the person that you were, and really like challenge these expectations of motherhood, challenge, this expectation that you do it all and that you be perfect, or that you need to be somewhere professionally in this moment. So really challenge those things and establish a routine for yourself. Normalize, your body, normalize your routine, really engage in activities that you used to enjoy and start taking care of yourself so that you can get back to that place professionally that you want to get back to.
Yeah. And I think like one of the things that worked for me, and also like I had to come because my older one is 5 and my younger one is 2. And I just kind of had to really come to that point. But I think what works for me is just to realizing that I can't do it all, This idea of balance, I always talk about it being so unhelpful, because I think it's almost like we have to find this balance where we're equally present there and there, which is really not possible, I think. So for me, I'm now very much aware that if I'm doing something career wise that is really important for me, if I have like a month that's very busy because, I have some, I don't know, like my practice is busy, I'm doing a lot of my corporate business, I really know that I'm not going to be the best parent. I'm not going to be as present with my kids. And this is just how it's going to be for this short period of time. So I will need a lot of extra support from my support network to do that. But also equally, when I'm with my kids, I know that I'm going to be like absent. I'm not going to achieve much. I'm not going to do like amazing things professionally, because also this is just kind of where I'm present. And I think just like releasing those pressures where I'm kind of, because I was literally, when I would be with kids, and I know like especially for those parents who are familiar with anxiety, it's almost like when I was at work, I would worry about kids. When I was with kids, I would worry about what I'm missing out on work. And it's almost like I was always in between those two. So I think for me, this is kind of the main boundary that I have, is just really to give myself permission. You don't need to do it all. When you work, enjoy it, love it, achieve, do things, just go out there. And also when I'm with the kids, just also allow that to be, because we can't do it all. No one can do it all.
No. And that's okay. And I
Yeah.
think that's, for me, personally and professionally, that is okay. And I am okay with that.
Yeah.
So that finding and understanding that is so important as part of your recovery and really transitioning back to work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. I really thank you for sharing some of your experience. We are going to put your contact details. You have, as you said, you do have psychotherapy practice. So perhaps kind of if any of you who is going to watch it would like to get in touch with Stephanie or have any questions, or also please share with us how was your experience going back to work, because it's really interesting for me to just kind of understand some of the experience, maybe share if the things that we've discussed resonate for you. Talk about what is kind of how do you try to cope with all the demands of being a working parent. Let us know if you have any secrets, or maybe becoming a parent completely changed your career. So anything, share, and let's together create a conversation about all emotional demands of parenting without shame and stigma. And thank you, Stephanie, again for coming.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I am licensed as a psychotherapist in New York and New Jersey in the US. If anyone feels that they are having a difficult time connecting with resources, it may not be me, it may be someone else. Please reach out. I am happy to, support and make those connections.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, you're not alone, and I just love that. I love that we're kind of it's all about the community and the support system. So I love that. Thank you for that.
Thank you.